Jack stood on the street corner, nervously glancing at his phone screen. The sun was slowly setting, bathing the streets of Chicago in a warm, golden light. Shadows stretched long across the pavement, and the city felt strangely empty. Few cars moved along the road, and silence blanketed the area, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. The usual noise of the bustling metropolis seemed to have dissolved into this calm, which only heightened his internal unease. He checked the route on the map again to make sure his taxi would arrive on time. Logan, his friend, was already waiting in the suburbs, and the ride wasn't supposed to take long, but Jack always felt a bit anxious traveling alone, especially by taxi. He wanted to get to the destination quickly, avoid unnecessary questions, and just relax. The thought of the evening ahead, hanging out with Logan, brought him some comfort, yet a nagging feeling remained at the back of his mind. Suddenly, his phone vibrated, notifying him that the car had arrived. He heard the soft hum of the engine and looked up. An old car came to a stop in front of him, its worn-out doors and dusty windows immediately catching his eye. Jack frowned slightly but quickly checked the license plate. It matched the one shown in the app, which reassured him a bit. The vehicle looked like it had seen better days, and its exterior bore the scars of time, a chipped bumper and faded paint that hinted at many previous journeys. Well, as long as I get there, he thought, putting his phone in his pocket. Without hesitation, he opened the back door and got in, feeling the cold touch of the faux leather seat. The interior had an outdated scent, a mix of stale air and something reminiscent of old fast food, but Jack tried to ignore it. For a moment, he lingered, looking at the driver. The man looked ordinary enough, light skin, short black hair, a torn denim jacket that seemed to have been his companion for years. Nothing seemed unusual. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror and nodded in greeting, not saying a word. Jack nodded back, feeling a slight tension as he adjusted himself in the seat, the fabric clinging to his back. The car started moving, merging into the light traffic on the street. Jack fastened his seatbelt, checked the route on his phone again, and tried to relax. The windows slowly filled with the view of Chicago's passing streets, familiar buildings, streetlights flickering to life, and vibrant billboards illuminating the dusk. He felt his anxiety begin to slowly fade as they glided along the road. As the city blurred into a hazy picture outside the window, Jack drifted into his thoughts, convincing himself that ahead lay just a calm evening with a friend. The rhythmic sounds of the tires rolling over the pavement and the soft murmurs of the city blended into a lullaby, and he allowed himself to sink into a moment of peace. The car moved smoothly, and for the first few minutes, the ride seemed perfectly ordinary. The driver remained silent, focused on the road ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel firmly. Jack, now calmer, took out his phone to check messages and distract himself from the lingering unease. The tranquility slowly enveloped him, and he was glad there was no need for small talk. He preferred the silence, where nothing pulled him away from his thoughts. But soon, the quiet was broken by the driver's voice, which came unexpectedly and somewhat out of place. "You visit your friends often?" he asked, without turning around, still watching the road. Jack froze for a second, lifting his eyes from his phone. The question caught him off guard, and he wasn't quite sure why the driver would need to know. He answered a bit hesitantly, "Well, sometimes, occasionally." He tried to sound casual, attempting to mask the unease creeping into his mind. But the feeling clung to him, refusing to let go. The driver smirked slightly, a hint of something unsettling in his demeanor, but kept his eyes fixed on the road, the streetlights flickering overhead. "Do you travel alone a lot? No one meeting you?" the driver continued, now with a noticeable interest in his voice, probing deeper. This question put Jack on alert. He frowned slowly, feeling a slight unease wash over him. Trying to avoid showing his true emotions, he shrugged and turned his gaze out the window. "Not really," he muttered, burying himself back in his phone, hoping this would signal the end of the conversation and the driver would take the hint. But the driver didn't seem to be finished yet. There was a new persistence in his tone, like a dog with a bone. "Parents must worry when you travel alone like this, right? Where are they?" the driver asked, a slight smirk playing on his lips, as if he enjoyed the exchange. Jack felt something unpleasant twist inside him at the personal nature of the questions. Each inquiry seemed to pull him deeper into discomfort, and with every word, his growing unease intensified. He quickly glanced at the driver. trying to figure out what he really meant. "They're at home," Jack replied curtly, his voice tense. He struggled to keep his composure, unwilling to reveal how deeply unsettled he felt. He returned his gaze to the window, watching the darkening cityscape blur past him, desperate to escape the prying questions and the watchful eyes of the driver. A few minutes had passed since Jack last checked the route. He hadn't been paying much attention to the time, assuming the trip was going as planned. But when he glanced at his phone again, his eyes froze on the screen. Something was wrong. The route line on the map had started to deviate from the path shown in the app. This unsettled him, and a knot tightened in his stomach. Jack looked up and noticed the car had turned onto a side street that appeared suspiciously empty and clearly wasn't leading to the suburbs where Logan lived. A chill ran down his spine as he watched the city lights fade behind them, replaced by abandoned buildings and sparse streetlights flickering eerily in the growing darkness. The shadows danced on the pavement, creating a foreboding atmosphere that sent shivers through him. "Hey, this isn't the right road," Jack said, trying to stay calm, though his inner anxiety was beginning to boil over, bubbling beneath the surface. His voice trembled slightly, betraying his fear. The driver didn't respond. He sat, eyes fixed on the road ahead, as if he hadn't heard or didn't want to hear what Jack said. The car kept moving, and each new turn only intensified Jack's sense of unease. The scenery shifted from familiar streets to desolate alleyways, and Jack quickly glanced at his phone again. This time, the route had completely changed. They were no longer heading toward the suburbs. "Why are we taking a different route?" Jack leaned forward, trying to catch the driver's attention. His voice carried a nervous edge, a tremor of panic beneath the surface as he attempted to maintain his composure. But again, there was silence. The driver didn't even bother to glance his way, as if Jack were no more than a shadow in the backseat. The tension grew with each passing second, and Jack felt his heart start to race. He looked around. The street was deserted, the buildings lifeless, no cars nearby. This was definitely not part of the usual route. His pulse quickened as adrenaline coursed through his veins. He checked the map again, and a sudden realization hit him. They were heading in an unknown direction, farther and farther from where he was supposed to be. The route was becoming increasingly erratic, and with every turn, Jack felt a sense of dread wash over him. He was entering a world that felt dangerous and unfamiliar, and the reassuring hum of the city felt like a distant memory. Anxiety, like a thick fog, slowly enveloped Jack. With each passing second in that car, he realized more clearly that this wasn't just a mistake or misunderstanding. Something was very wrong. His instincts, usually silent in ordinary situations, suddenly began screaming of impending danger. A voice inside him repeated one thing: "Don't show fear." Jack knew that if the driver sensed even the slightest hint of panic, the situation could worsen dramatically. He tried to breathe evenly, inhaling through his nose and exhaling through his mouth, striving to maintain a calm exterior. His heart was pounding, but he willed his face to remain stoic, a mask of composure over the turmoil inside. Every muscle in his body was tense, like a string ready to snap at any moment. Jack knew he needed to think clearly and act fast. His fingers instinctively gripped the strap of his backpack, as if that could give him some semblance of control over the situation. Slowly and discreetly, he began scanning his surroundings, trying to assess the situation and plan possible escape routes. The barren streets outside offered little comfort, but he started recalling the last intersections, narrow streets, and shuttered shops that had flashed by the windows like scenes from a movie. These images flickered through his mind, offering potential keys to his escape. "If I can get the door open, I can jump out at the next stoplight. I just need to wait for the right moment," he thought, struggling to keep his mind focused and sharp. Trying not to draw attention to himself, Jack reached for the door handle, his fingers cautiously searching for the lock. He had barely touched the cold metal, ready to test the door, when a sharp and alarming sound broke the silence. Click. The sound of the door locks engaging reverberated through him like an electric shock. Jack froze, his heart skipping a beat. He shot a quick glance at the driver. The man was still staring straight ahead, never once turning around, but his hand remained on the lock button, an ominous sign of control. Jack's attempt to escape hadn't gone unnoticed, and the realization sent a chilling wave down his spine. He was now trapped. Outside, empty streets, shrouded in shadows, around him, only the silent, gray buildings looming like sentinels. The driver could take him anywhere. And Jack was helpless, locked inside the car. The doors are locked. How do I get out now? Thoughts raced wildly through his mind, but no solutions emerged. The plans he had been forming just moments ago crumbled one by one, like sand slipping through his fingers. The oppressive atmosphere of the car felt suffocating, and with every heartbeat, Jack sensed the encroaching danger, an undeniable urgency to escape before it was too late. Jack's heart raced faster as the car slowly approached an old, abandoned warehouse. The building loomed ominously in the fading light, looking as if it hadn't been touched in decades. Its walls were peeling, the paint faded to a dull gray, and graffiti sprawled across the surface like chaotic brushstrokes. The roof sagged in places, giving the structure a dilapidated appearance that seemed to whisper stories of neglect and decay. There wasn't a soul in sight. Not a single sound broke the suffocating silence that enveloped the area. It was a deafening, oppressive quiet that pressed against him, making him want to escape as soon as possible. The driver didn't say a word or make any move, his expression unreadable as the car glided to a stop right next to the warehouse wall. Jack felt a knot tighten in his stomach as the man paused for a second, still not looking at him. Inside the vehicle, the atmosphere became so still that Jack could hear the rapid thud of his own heart pounding in his chest, a relentless drumbeat of fear. He glanced at the driver, who was still staring straight ahead. As if nothing unusual was happening in a place like this. What's next? Jack mentally asked himself, but the only response was an increasing sense of fear that coiled tighter around him. He felt this was the moment that would determine his fate. If he didn't take action now, if he didn't try to escape or find a way out of this trap, he might never have another chance. The weight of that realization settled heavily on his shoulders. Jack's hands involuntarily trembled as adrenaline coursed through his veins. He slowly reached for his backpack, each movement feeling like it was wrapped in molasses, but one thought kept pounding in his mind: run. Now or never. The urgency of the moment surged within him, a primal instinct to survive. The warehouse loomed ominously outside the window, a reminder that time was slipping away. Without waiting for an explanation or the driver's next move, Jack acted on instinct. With a swift motion, he grabbed his backpack and pushed the car door open, which creaked unpleasantly as it swung outward. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silence, amplifying the tension that hung in the air. The moment his feet touched the cold asphalt, everything around him seemed to slow down, and his mind settled on one decisive thought: run. Without looking back, without hesitation. As soon as he was outside, the icy air hit his face, burning his cheeks and shocking him into clarity. His heart raced in his chest so hard that it felt like it could be heard from a mile away, a frantic drum echoing in the stillness. Jack stumbled on the broken asphalt, his shoes slipping on the gravel and puddles, but he didn't stop. His eyes feverishly searched for cover, for safety, and then he saw it: the forest. Dark silhouettes of trees stretched beyond the warehouse, their dense crowns intertwining in wild chaos. This was his salvation, his only chance to escape. A sharp sound came from behind, the car door opening, and loud footsteps began to approach. The driver jumped out and shouted something, but Jack didn't listen. In his mind, there was only one command: run. Every muscle in his body was tense, and each step sent pain shooting through his legs, but he couldn't allow himself to stop. He pushed through the fear, focusing solely on the forest ahead. The trees drew nearer, their gnarled branches reaching out like desperate fingers. Jack felt the driver chasing him, the footsteps growing louder, his breathing heavier. Branches whipped at his face and hands, and his clothes snagged on thorny bushes. But that didn't matter. Jack continued to run, nearly blind in his determination, pushing through the dense undergrowth that surrounded him. The air burned in his lungs, each breath a struggle against the cold that filled the forest. Fear surged through him, stronger than fatigue, propelling him forward. With each second, the forest swallowed him deeper, hiding him among the trees. Jack knew that only here, among the shadows and bushes, did he have a chance to survive. Each rustle of leaves and snap of twigs underfoot became a part of the cacophony of his escape, driving him deeper into the unknown, where he could finally hope to find safety. Behind him, Jack could clearly hear the heavy footsteps of the driver, and the sound of their approach seemed to tear through the silence of the forest. Each footfall on the ground felt like a thunderclap, echoing between the trees and drowning out Jack's own breath, which had become erratic and labored. Branches whipped at his face, leaving small cuts, while bushes snagged at his clothes as if trying to hold him back. But pain didn't matter, only running did. Each step felt slower than the last, as if his legs were starting to give out and exhaustion was engulfing his entire body. The driver was getting closer. Jack could feel it. The sounds of footsteps behind him grew louder and quicker, and fear tightened its grip on his mind. He didn't dare look back too often, fearing he would lose his momentum, but every attempt to catch a glimpse of his pursuer only intensified his horror. His heart was pounding so hard in his chest that he felt it might burst out at any moment. He realized that if he didn't do something urgently, find cover or, even better, encounter someone who could help, he would certainly be caught. The pursuer showed no signs of giving up, and Jack had no choice but to keep running. He quickly glanced back, hoping to see a glimpse of light or any chance for salvation amid the gloomy thicket. But all he could see were the dark silhouettes of trees and endless underbrush. The forest seemed to close in around him, as if it were trying to snuff out any hope of escape. Jack was racing through the woods, stumbling and losing his balance when his feet unexpectedly led him to a small path. Before him stood figures, a gray-haired man and his son, both carrying baskets full of kindling. Jack nearly collided with them, stopping so abruptly that his breath hitched completely. At that moment, all his fear and exhaustion crashed down on him at once, and he struggled to force out the words. The man and his son immediately sensed that something was wrong with the young man before them. Jack stood there, panting, panic in his eyes, as if he were fleeing from something terrifying. The old man furrowed his brow, his gray eyebrows knitting together, and his gaze became sharp and wary. "Please, help me," Jack gasped, grabbing at the air. His voice trembled, and terror was evident in his eyes. "Someone is chasing me. The driver. He's after me." The old man silently exchanged a glance with his son, as if they were sharing a wordless question. The young man quickly scanned the surroundings, trying to assess how close the danger was. The sounds of footsteps and the snapping of breaking branches echoed from behind the trees. Jack hadn't even realized how close the pursuer had gotten. "It's okay, son," the man said calmly, though there was an undercurrent of hidden concern in his voice. "Follow us." He swiftly lifted his basket and nodded to his son. Both of them began to retreat from the path, leading Jack behind them. The urgency in their movements became palpable as they heard the footsteps of the driver growing louder behind the trees. The elderly man acted quickly and without unnecessary words. He set aside the basket of kindling, pulled out an old mobile phone from his pocket, and dialed 911. His movements were confident, though hidden anxiety was evident in his face and voice. "Yes, we're in the woods, near the old warehouse on the outskirts of town," he said in a steady voice, trying to convey the urgency of the situation without succumbing to panic. "A young man is being chased. We urgently need help." Jack stood nearby, unable to keep still. He trembled despite his efforts to remain composed. Every movement felt out of place. His hands nervously fumbled with his backpack while his eyes darted around, as if the driver might emerge from the trees at any moment. The man's words to the dispatcher reached Jack as if through a fog. When he heard that the police were already on their way, something inside him eased. The anxiety didn't vanish, but it no longer consumed his mind entirely. His heart, which had been racing just moments before, began to slow its frantic rhythm. "They're on their way," the man said quietly but calmly, hanging up the phone. The old man and his son exchanged glances, then both took Jack by the arms and led him a little further away from the open path. They hid behind thick bushes where they could observe the road leading into the forest. Jack tried to focus on this temporary shelter, calming his breath as his rescuers remained silent, listening intently for any sounds in the woods. A police car quickly arrived at the scene, illuminating the forest with its bright flashing lights, which seemed especially vivid against the deepening twilight. Their beams danced on the tree branches, casting flickering shadows that added to the already tense atmosphere. The doors of the car slammed open, and two fully equipped officers cautiously stepped out. They paused for a moment, surveying the surroundings, as if assessing how dangerous the situation could be before approaching Jack and his unexpected rescuers. "Are you all right?" asked one of the officers. Young and composed, but his eyes betrayed his tension. He looked directly at Jack, noticing his disheveled appearance and labored breathing. Jack nodded, trying to gather his thoughts, though his heart was still racing, and his mind was a jumble of fear and confusion. Yes. But Jack began, stumbling over his words. The driver, he was chasing me. He took a deep breath to steady himself. The memories were still too fresh, making it hard for him to speak calmly. The officer waited patiently, not interrupting, giving Jack time to regain his breath. When Jack finally managed to continue, he tried to be as precise as possible, relaying every detail. A light-skinned man, Jack began, his hands trembling slightly and his voice shaking. Short black hair, a torn denim jacket. He was asking strange questions. Jack paused for a moment, trying to recall as much as he could. And then he suddenly veered off the route without warning. The other officer, standing a little further back, was writing down every word. He listened intently, nodding periodically to acknowledge what he heard. Jack saw them exchange brief glances, discussing among themselves what to do next. Meanwhile, the second officer began questioning the elderly man and his son to compare their accounts with Jack's story. As the interrogation came to a close, a voice crackled through the radio from one of the patrols sent to search for the driver. "We found the car. It's parked at the abandoned warehouse," he reported. The officers exchanged glances, and the one taking notes raised the radio to his lips. "Is the driver there?" he asked, holding his breath. The answer came a few seconds later. "No, the car is empty. No sign of the driver." Jack felt his heart race again. The driver had vanished, and that meant the danger was still nearby. As the initial shock began to fade and a relative silence settled over the forest, Jack finally managed to relax a little. His breathing steadied, but strange thoughts swirled in his mind, details that had seemed unimportant until now. With the police asking more specific questions, he started recalling small things that might hold significance. One of the officers, the one conducting the interrogation, returned to Jack, squatting down to meet his gaze. "You've already shared a lot, but is there anything else? Anything that seemed unusual about his appearance or behavior?" the officer asked in a gentle yet persistent tone. Jack paused for a moment, running his fingers over his jacket as if trying to find the right images in his mind. There was a pendant around his neck. He suddenly spoke, as if the memory had popped into his head unexpectedly. He looked up at the officer, wanting to explain as clearly as possible. A letter, "C," was engraved on it. A pretty big letter, simple. It struck me as odd. I don't know why. The officer nodded, jotting this down in his notebook, although his gaze remained focused, as if he were trying to find something meaningful in this detail. "Anything else?" he asked again, patiently awaiting further information. Jack furrowed his brow, trying to remember every moment. He already felt as though he was forgetting important details due to the overall shock. But then another detail came to his mind that now seemed concerning. He had a torn sleeve, Jack suddenly said, gesturing to his own forearm. On his denim jacket. I noticed it when he locked the doors. His voice trembled slightly as he recalled the moment of panic when he realized he wouldn't be able to escape the car. The police officers exchanged glances upon hearing this. They clearly began to connect these small details, trying to form a clearer picture. "This could help," one of them said in a more assured tone, writing down the new information. "We'll take this into account during the search." Jack sighed, feeling his anxiety rise again, despite the apparent assistance from the police. These strange details that had seemed insignificant at the time now took on greater meaning and could become key to capturing the driver. Several days passed since the incident, but Jack couldn't shake the events from his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of the driver with his strange smile and cold gaze reappeared. Despite his attempts to distract himself, something inside wouldn't let go. Jack constantly wondered, who was this person, and why had he chosen him as a victim? While Jack tried to return to a normal life, the police were not idle. The investigation was ongoing, and each day brought new developments. Officers focused on the car found at the abandoned warehouse. Although the driver had vanished, they managed to examine the vehicle in detail, and some clues began to lead them to new leads. One morning, while Jack was at home, he received a call from the police. They informed him that they had made progress in the investigation. "We found something that will help us identify this person," said a voice on the other end of the line. "We examined the car and discovered that he used someone else's taxi license." This news hit Jack like a thunderbolt. He had sensed something was off about the driver, but he never imagined that he could be so cunning. The use of someone else's license meant the criminal was deliberately hiding his identity, and this was no accident. Jack took a deep breath, feeling his heart tighten with anxiety again. The police explained that this complicated matters. They needed to find out who the rightful owner of the license was and how it had come into the hands of this person. The investigation was already leading them deeper into the dark recesses of the criminal world than they had initially anticipated. "We're confident this person has used fake documents before," the officer continued. "He's clearly a professional and carefully plans each step to avoid leaving traces." These words filled Jack with even more concern. He realized he was not dealing with an ordinary criminal but with an experienced, cunning, and dangerous individual who could remain under the radar of justice for a long time. All the details that had seemed insignificant were now forming a picture indicating that something bigger was behind his abduction. "We're continuing our work, but it may take time," the officer added. "Please be cautious and stay in touch." After hanging up, Jack sat in silence for a long time, trying to process what he had heard. Now that his abductor was still at large and the police had just begun to untangle the web of mysteries, he understood this was not the end of the story. Perhaps it was just the beginning. As the police delved deeper into the investigation, the events began to form a larger and more frightening picture. Each day, it became increasingly clear that Jack's case was just one part of a much more troubling pattern. The officers started comparing Jack's testimony with other cases, and suddenly everything began to take on new meaning. Several weeks prior, there had been disappearances of teenagers in the Chicago area, but no one had connected them. The missing teens vanished after late-night taxi rides or from cars summoned through mobile apps, yet investigators had overlooked these incidents. All these cases seemed isolated until Jack's abduction occurred. His testimony became the key to unraveling a scheme that had remained in the shadows. The police analyzed data from similar incidents and began to notice a pattern. All disappearances shared the same signs. Teens entered cars driven by individuals using fake documents, and the teens never re-established contact. None of them had been found. Now the police realized that a serial criminal might be operating in the city, someone who carefully planned his actions and left no traces. Each new clue intensified their suspicions. The perpetrator's method was so sophisticated that everything had previously seemed coincidental. But now, with every new detail, they understood they were dealing with an experienced predator who used cunning tricks to abduct his victims. The driver Jack encountered was merely a part of this complex network. Jack, informed of these revelations, felt a chill within. The realization that his case was not unique, that he could have become just another victim of this criminal, made his blood run cold. He had narrowly escaped the fate that befell other teens. He was lucky, but this fact offered no comfort. Instead, his anxiety only increased. Now Jack knew he was not just a random target. Someone had chosen him deliberately. What if that driver tried again? It had only been a week since Jack endured the horrific night of his abduction and barely escaped. Despite his anxious thoughts and nightmares, he tried to return to normal life. But the peace was short-lived. One day, he received another call from the police. The detective's voice carried a grim tension. "Jack, I have important news," the detective began. "There has been another abduction." Jack felt his heart sink. These were the words he had feared to hear since that day he escaped. "His name is Ben," the detective continued. "He's 16 years old. He got into a car that resembles the one you described and hasn't returned home. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get to him in time. Ben couldn't be saved." Each word struck Jack like a hammer. Thoughts spiraled. Another teen, another abduction, this time with a tragic outcome. He imagined Ben's face, a boy he didn't know, but now felt connected to by shared fate. "Ben?" was all Jack could whisper as the news sunk in. Jack froze, realizing how thin the line was between his salvation and what happened to Ben. He could have easily been in Ben's place if not for the strangers who happened to be nearby in the forest. This realization pierced through his sense of horror and helplessness. At the moment when his own life could have ended, Ben was unable to escape. And now Jack couldn't shake the thought, things could have turned out differently. The world around him seemed to narrow, and every little detail from that day came rushing back into his consciousness. Again and again, he replayed the events in his mind, trying to comprehend how he managed to escape while Ben had not. This tragic turn of events stirred in Jack not only guilt and anxiety but also something new. He realized he could no longer sit idly by. If he didn't try to help the police, if he didn't do everything possible to catch the kidnapper, it could happen again. Fear had not left Jack since he learned about Ben's abduction. Thoughts of how things could have been different haunted him. Every night, images of the forest, the abandoned warehouse, and the face of the driver who trapped him flashed before him. But Jack understood. Fear could no longer control his life. He realized that despite what he had endured, he couldn't stay on the sidelines while someone else might become the next victim. One morning, gathering his thoughts, he took his phone and dialed the detective he had spoken to after the incident. Jack felt nervous, but his determination wouldn't let him back down. "Hello, this is Jack. I want to help. I think I can remember more," he said when the detective answered. "We're glad to hear from you, Jack. Your help could really make a difference," the detective replied, a note of hope in his voice. When they met, Jack began to recall the events of that horrible night with new clarity. His memory kindly brought forth one detail that had initially seemed insignificant, but now, thinking back on it, it took on new meaning. "He said something strange," Jack began, straining to remember. "When we were driving, before everything got really scary, he talked about the place where everything ends." The detectives immediately perked up at this. They asked Jack to elaborate, but even he didn't fully understand what it could mean. "He said it at some point, almost casually. But I didn't pay much attention to it then. Now I think it could be related to where he was taking me," Jack continued, replaying moments from that night in his head. The detectives exchanged glances and took notes. Jack felt that this phrase could be the key, perhaps to the location where the criminal held others. He knew the driver hadn't succeeded in carrying out his plan with him, but he probably had already selected the next location for his victim. Jack felt relieved that he had finally shared this important detail. Though fear still lingered nearby, he now knew he could do something more than just hide. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone unnoticed in that fateful place where they had tried to capture him. Reluctantly, he agreed to return to the abandoned warehouse with the police, although fear still overwhelmed him inside. He knew that every new detail could bring them closer to catching the criminal. The police had already searched the area, but Jack felt that there was something hidden that they might have missed. The old warehouse looked even more ominous in the early morning light. The graffiti-covered walls and broken windows created an atmosphere of desolation and mystery. The officers moved cautiously, examining every corner, carefully scrutinizing the cracks in the walls and the discarded items. "There's definitely something else here," one of the officers quietly said, directing his flashlight to the floor. Jack stood a bit behind, watching as the officers methodically explored the building. Suddenly, one of them noticed a metal hatch hidden under a layer of dust and debris. It was a concealed door in the floor that had gone unnoticed before. Jack's heart raced again as he realized this could be something significant. "There's something down here," the officer said, signaling to the others. They cautiously lifted the heavy metal cover and discovered a dark staircase leading down to a basement. The police turned on their flashlights and began descending, while Jack remained above, peering into the abyss with anxious anticipation. The basement turned out to be much larger than they had expected. Dark and damp, with shabby walls, it resembled an abandoned underground hideout. They stumbled upon eerie discoveries: remnants of food, torn ropes that had clearly been used to bind people, personal belongings, clothes and backpacks scattered in the corners. These items undoubtedly belonged to teens who likely never returned home. The air grew heavy with the realization that this place had been used for something horrific. The officers exchanged glances, understanding they had found a crucial piece of evidence. Jack stood at the edge of the staircase, feeling a chilling fear wash over him. Now he knew for certain, this place was part of the criminal's plan, the place where everything ends. As the police began examining the evidence found at the abandoned warehouse, the picture of the crime gradually became clearer and more terrifying. They quickly realized that the driver who had abducted Jack was not just a lone criminal. He was merely one element in a broader, meticulously organized network involved in human trafficking. Jack was shocked to learn that his abduction was not a random event. The entire situation, from the choice of taxi to the driver's odd questions and route changes, had been part of a complex scheme. The driver was not working alone, a whole group of people was behind him, using similar methods to abduct teenagers throughout the city. The police began to find connections between other disappearance cases that had previously seemed unrelated. Each new finding deepened the understanding that they were not just dealing with a crime but a sprawling network that operated cautiously and covertly. The police concluded that this group had been active for several years, quietly kidnapping individuals and transporting them through carefully planned routes. Jack felt a growing horror at having been part of this conspiracy. He had narrowly escaped the fate of other victims, and this realization frightened him while also instilling a sense of responsibility. Meanwhile, the police began preparing a large-scale operation to expose the entire criminal network. They needed to gather all possible resources. For now, it was not just about catching one criminal, but about dismantling an entire underground business. The police devised a bold and risky plan aimed at capturing the entire criminal group. Jack was to be used as bait. He would pretend to be yet another victim. Despite the danger, Jack agreed to participate. He understood that this was the only chance to stop the criminals. And he was willing to take the risk to put an end to the abductions. The plan was meticulously crafted. Jack was to get into a taxi again, just like on that fateful day. But several undercover officers disguised as casual passers-by were positioned nearby, ready to monitor the situation and react instantly. Every detail was carefully thought out. Jack was given instructions in case something went awry, and he was equipped with a panic button to signal for help at any moment. The police anticipated that the abductors would try to pull their usual trick, diverting from the route and leading the victim to a desolate place. When everything was ready, Jack anxiously awaited the arrival of the car. He had to suppress his fear and gather his courage. Inside him, a mix of tension and determination surged. The car arrived, and Jack climbed into the back seat. The police signaled over the radio for everyone to prepare. The silence on the air emphasized the seriousness of the moment. As the car began to move, Jack felt a sense of déjà vu. Everything unfolded just as it had on that day, a calm ride that seemed normal. But with each turn, his anxiety grew. The driver, sitting behind the wheel, was a new participant in the operation, but Jack knew they were watching not just him, but the entire network. Suddenly, the car veered off the route, just as it had before. Jack pressed the panic button, signaling to the police. Seconds passed like an eternity before several police cars with sirens blaring surrounded the vehicle. The entire operation took mere minutes. The police blocked the road, and hidden agents rushed to assist. At that moment, it was clear, the criminals had nowhere to run. The operation that Jack and the police had meticulously planned was coming to a conclusion. As the sirens pierced the silence, the driver was engulfed in instant confusion. He attempted to accelerate, but the surrounding police cars left him no chance of escape. The police acted in unison, textbook style. The taxi was blocked, and armed officers immediately surrounded the vehicle. The driver slowly raised his hands, realizing that resistance was futile. He didn't even attempt to justify his actions, he simply coldly observed as they pulled him from the car. It seemed to him that this was just the end of one game in which he had been exposed. But for Jack, this moment meant something much more significant, the long-awaited conclusion to the nightmare that had begun with that fateful ride. While the driver and his accomplices were arrested, Jack sat on the roadside, still trembling from the tension. The police approached him one by one to express their gratitude for his bravery. He couldn't believe that it was all really over. Watching the criminals being taken away in police cars, he felt true relief for the first time. Later, at the police station, the detectives informed Jack that the operation had been successful. Thanks to his help, not only was the driver arrested, but the entire criminal network was exposed. Many members of this network were apprehended that same day, and their operations of abduction and human trafficking were halted. The police highly valued Jack's contribution to the investigation. His testimony and determination not only helped expose the criminals but also prevented further abductions. Despite everything he had endured, Jack realized that the risk had been worth it. When it was all over, Jack finally returned to his normal life. He now knew that he had become part of something larger. His courage and willingness to help not only saved his own life but also helped other teenagers avoid a terrible fate.